Hi, you guys. Well, thank you so very much for joining us today. Today, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Morgan Christman, which I had the pleasure of meeting last year at a conference. So I'm very excited to have her here today, especially because this week is National Insect Week. So this would be a perfect combination of the research that she's doing in combination of this week of trying to celebrate our pollinators. So a little background about Dr. Morgan Christman. She is a postdoctoral research in the Department of Entomology at the Ohio State University of Columbus, Ohio. Most research assistants the impacts of climate change, habitat quality, and the land management practices on bumblebees, particularly the endangered rusty patches bumblebees. She received her Ph.D. in ecology from Utah State University, where she was also a National Science Foundation trainee within the Climate Adaptation Science program. Prior to her PhD, Most graduated from a bachelor's in science in biology and a bachelor's associates in environmental science from Denison University. A little fun facts about her. She has a very spoiled pit bull named Carlton, who she loves to take out for hikes. And on her free time, she loves boxing and sparring. So with that, I will take the floor over to Mo.
Hi. So thanks, Anita, for inviting me and for the Institute of Conservation Research and Education for hosting this lovely event. I'm super excited to be here to talk about some of my other research with raising bumblebees in captivity for pollination and conservation purposes. First, I want to start out by saying Happy Pollinator Week to everybody. This is a special week, especially for somebody like me who has focused their entire career on bumblebees and helping the betterment of pollinators. So my work focuses on bumblebees, and I think they're really cool, not only because they're fuzzy and adorable, but also because they are abundant pollinators throughout temperate, alpine and subarctic environments all around the world, and they can be found on most continents. And little known fact is that there are 265 species worldwide, and 47 of which occur in the US. So we have a pretty good distribution and diversity of bumblebees that we can find throughout the environment in our country. So as pollinators, they're generalist foragers, meaning that they can forage and pollinate a variety of different plants, including wildflowers, cultivated crops, and then greenhouse plants. And they can do this very effectively with two advantageous traits, one of which is their long corollas, or their long tongues, which are able to reach down into the corollas of flowers, which a lot of other insects aren't able to get into the deep corollas. And in addition, they also have the ability to sonicate. And this is a form of buzz pollination where the bumblebee will land on the flower and then vibrate. And this shakes pollen grains loose, and then the pollen gets dislodged and goes on the bumblebee's fur. And then it can get packed into their corbicula on their back leg. And that helps the bumblebee to then carry pollen from one flower to another, and then to bring it back to their colony. So when we think about bumblebees, they are primitively eusocial, so they spend a majority of their life cycle with other workers, males, and reproductives, and they have a very structured colony that they exist within. So going over the colony life cycle, at the beginning, we have a gyne, which is a reproductive female that hasn't become a queen yet, but will once she lays brood and produces a colony. So we have a gyne that emerges from her hibernaculum, which is her overwintering site. And then she goes out and searches for a nesting site, typically in logs, open grass areas, or underground. And then they go out and forage for pollen and nectar, and then they bring that back to their nesting site. And from there, we then have the pollen and nectar that has been created into pollen provisions that the queen, which was previously a gyne, lays her eggs on, which are called brood. And as these brood develop, they emerge into workers, which are the females, and then the queen continues to produce more brood, mainly workers towards the beginning of the year, and then males and new gynes towards the end of the year. And during this time, the workers are taking care of the colony by helping to clean the colony, forage, and help with brood care. And then towards the fall and winter, we have new reproductive males and gynes emerge, and then these mate with males or gynes from other colonies. And then the new gynes search for a hibernaculum, so we see over here underground, and then they overwinter. And after this point, the males workers and then the foundress queen all die, and then the cycle continues. So when we're thinking about the majority of a colony's life cycle, most of it's occurring underground in their nesting sites, or it can also be above ground. But in dense layers of vegetation, bunches of grass, hollow logs, and abandoned rodent burrows. So this means that their colonies are pretty cryptic and really hard to know what's going on within these colonies. So there's a lot of unknowns when we think about colony development. In addition to there being a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of species-specific differences that we're just not able to determine when we're not able to see them. And this can be anything from their nest initiation, so when they produce brood or lay their eggs, their nest establishment, which is when we have the emergence of a first worker, and then the number of offspring and reproductives produced, which identifies their colony size and their colony developmental timelines. So with all of this, we can really increase the knowledge of bumblebee nesting biology by obtaining data from colonies that we can raise in a lab to help better understand like what these species are doing while they're underground. So for my work, this past year, I've been mostly focused on the yellow-faced bumblebee, which is a bumblebee that is found in open grassy areas, urban parks and gardens, and shrubland and mountain meadows. And it is strictly distributed throughout California, Oregon, and Washington, which makes it have a fairly narrow range, especially in comparison to some of our other bumblebee species throughout the US. So for our study, we went out this past spring and net collected 158 foraging gynes, which were the reproductive females as they emerged from overwintering in Oregon. And we got to do this up in the mountains. It was beautiful, and I had a lot of fun being able to go out and do this. Then once we collected all the bumblebees, we brought them back to our lab in Ohio, and we put them into these little rearing units. And we had 125 that were able to be placed in these units after traveling them back to Ohio from Oregon. And then within each of these rearing units, we place a pollen for them to consume, which is comprised of pollen and artificial nectar that is then coated in wax. And then a artificial nectar, which is placed underneath this part that they can then feed on through a feeding wick. So look at the inside of what a new colony looks like to get a better idea of what we're actually looking at on a daily basis. We have this cool diagram where we have our reproductive female, so in this case, a queen, since she has founded a colony. And then we have our artificial pollen nectar provisions. And then as the colony develops, we have the queen produce brood, which is identified right here. And this is where the larva develops and feeds on the pollen as time goes on. And once the brood completely develops, it closes from its pupal cell, which we can see here as this worker is chewing her way out, starting to emerge. And then once she fully emerges, we then have the worker and then open brood cells that are left after they've closed from their pupal cells. And this work is really cool because we're able to see like the miracle of life and get to know what's actually happening in these colonies. And I just think it's super cool that we're able to see the emergence of a bee from its pupal cell and to learn how like their sisters will help them with chewing the wax to help break them out. And yeah, so I watched this video a lot because I think it's just beautiful to watch what bees will do in nature and how the other sisters will care and help incubate the larvae that are developing in these cells. So while we're caring for our colonies, we do all of this under red light to help prevent them from being disturbed or stressed, since they are primarily found underground and spend a majority of their life not being bothered by humans. So while we're caring for them, we both feed them, clean them, and transfer the colonies to different boxes. We make sure to do this in the most safe and stress-free way as possible, and clean. And we check our colonies every other day over the course of their development. And during this time, we document when the colony produces brood. So when they first initiate their nest, when the first worker closes, like we saw in that last video, which identifies their nest establishment success, as well as the number of offspring and reproductives produced. And this is a pretty, say, like medium-sized colony. They can get upwards of about 250 colonies for this specific species. And then we can just watch different behaviors and document their colony developmental timelines. So as we go through our results from our rearing of the bees, we found that of the 125 colonies that were installed, we had about 62.4% that produced brood cells. So going back to where our pupal cells are developing within these wax cases. And then of these, we had 43% that had at least one worker close. And this is to establish successful nest establishment. Then we were able to document the size of the colonies as well as how many reproductives were produced. So reproductives meaning the new gynes that will then go on to found new colonies in the future. So with our colonies, we had sizes ranging from just a single worker to 247 workers. And this is pretty standard for this species being reared in other controlled settings where they can get upwards of like 350 workers, but ours got pretty close, but not that high. And then something that we're really excited about was that we were able to get 237 new gynes produced. So these are, let's see, we can see some of them in here where they're the larger bees in comparison to our little workers that are in there. And with these gynes, we're able to learn more about the mating process of bumblebee biology. And I think this is really cool because when you're out in the wild, you can sometimes see insects mating, but you can't really understand like the full process of it by just getting little snippets in time. So when we're able to do it in a controlled setting, actually, before I get into that, so when we look at bumblebee mating biology, we have reproductive individuals that feed on pollen and nectar for several days after they've eclosed from their pupal cells, and they do this until they reach sexual maturity. These males and gynes then leave the colony and search for mates from other colonies. And typically the gyne will only mate with a single male. However, it has been documented that multiple mating can occur for some species. But with all that said, there's really still not a ton known about like this process or how long it occurs. So in our controlled settings, we paired our gynes, which were female workers, after them feeding for about a week after they've emerged. And then we took a actual handful of males and threw them into a little rearing container. And you can see our little male falling down into our containers. And then we stood in the room and watched until they coupled. And once the male and female coupled, we then pulled them out of the mating container and threw them into these little deli containers. And this allowed us to get the start and end times of each mating event to get the full duration. So overall, we found that mating has a fairly broad range in time, going from 3 minutes to 4 hours and 19 minutes with an average of about 57 minutes. So this is really cool that we were able to see this at all, really, because you would never think that bumblebees would be able to mate this long out in the wild. And it is possible that because they were in a controlled lab setting where they are protected from a lot of predators, since they are in an enclosed space, that this might be a little bit biased towards the higher end, but still really cool that we were able to see that they are able to mate for a fairly long period of time. And then once we had all of our bees that were mated, we then could learn more about the overwintering process, which really is very understudied for bumblebee biology. So what we do know is that at the end of the season, when the gynes have mated, they then go and build up their fat reserves by eating as much pollen and nectar as they can. And this allows them to sustain themselves through the winter as they overwinter, pretty similarly to bears, where they go into hibernation, and they do this in abandoned animal burrows, or they excavate holes in dirt or plant debris. And they'll stay in these areas for anywhere from like 4 to 6 months, depending on where they are geographically. And this means that they have a pretty high mortality because during this time, they're exposed to a lot of environmental conditions. They're not protected from predators. So we really don't know a lot about what goes on and different facets that can help improve their overwintering survival, such as whether or not there's a threshold for how much fat reserves they need to be able to sustain themselves through the winter. So we wanted to see if we could overwinter our mated bumblebees in our lab. So we took our mated bumblebees and we placed them into cold storage, which was either at 1 or 6 degrees in a mini refrigerator that you can buy at any Walmart. And we placed them inside these little jewelry boxes with a piece of cardboard and then a paper towel. And this allowed them to have something to cling on to and like burrow in while they're overwintering. And they stayed in these cold storage conditions for 54 days. And during this time, we checked them weekly for survival. So overall, we had 151 or 191 gynes that were overwintered, and 65.4% of them survived overwintering. And when we look at the breakdown between being stored at 1 degree versus 6 degrees, we didn't really find much of a difference between their survival at these different temperatures. However, it was slightly higher at the 1 degree end, which is interesting, but it would make sense. It does make sense given that these bees were collected at high elevation sites out in Oregon, up in the mountains where they are more acclimated to colder temperatures. So overall from this study, we were able to develop successful rearing techniques for the yellow-faced bumblebee, Bombus vosnesenskii. And this helps to increase our knowledge of their nesting, mating, and overwintering biology. But something I think that is even more impactful and has broader implications is that we're able to gain a lot of information from these species, and we can do this across a wide variety of species. So we don't need to just look at our yellow-faced bumblebee. And in addition, being able to rear these bees in captivity, we're able to potentially commercially produce them for pollination services, and then to use captive rearing for conservation practices via assisted reintroductions. So I'm going to go into those a little bit because I think it is why this work is so cool and important. So when we think about the considerations for commercially producing bumblebees, there are several facets that need to be considered. So first is whether they can be successfully reared in a controlled environment. So whether we're able to have colonies that produce brood and then produce workers, and are able to develop a healthy population. Then we need to look at whether they can be successfully mated within a controlled setting, and whether they can be successfully placed into diapause or their overwintering conditions, and have fairly high survival rates. Additionally, we need to look at their ability to effectively pollinate target crops within greenhouse settings where they're typically placed, as well as different life history traits and whether they're resistant to pathogens or pests, which impact the health of a colony. So when we're thinking about commercial production, there's really two companies that have controlled this market. It's BioBest and Copert, and they have, over the last several decades, have produced 4 bumblebees commercially. So the first is the Western bumblebee, which was abandoned in the 1990s as a commercially viable option because of their really high infection rates with pathogens, which meant that the colonies were getting sick, and the colonies that were being shipped out to these different locations to help pollinate crops were then going out into the environment and getting other wild bee species sick. And this is really problematic. It's a process called spillover, where you have commercially produced bees then spilling over into the environment and getting native species sick. And because of this, the Copert was like, no, we can't be doing this anymore. We're not producing it. We have to find another viable option. And when they did this, they said, okay, let's look at the Eastern bumblebee, which is the most common bumblebee in the Eastern US. And it is broadly available anywhere in the Eastern US, but it can also be shipped out into the Western US where it's not natively found. And with doing this, there are risks in place, or there's risks and restrictions in place to help prevent this species from invading non-native areas where they could then outcompete some of the native species. And as a result, in 2021, Copert and BioBest picked up 2 new species, the yellow-faced bumblebee, which is the one we presented my research on, and then the Hunt's bumblebee. So the yellow-faced bumblebee, since it is only distributed throughout California, Oregon, and Washington is only available within those 3 states for commercial production. And then the Hunt's bumblebee is only available in Western Canada, but as a broadly distributed species in the Western US, we're hoping that it will become commercially available within the next few years. And all of these are really important for commercial production of greenhouse crops in particular. So they're really, really great greenhouse pollinators for a variety of crops, including tomatoes, peppers, strawberries, blueberries, melons. So like all the good fruits and veggies that we all love to eat. And they're really effective pollinators of these crops, and in many cases are better pollinators than your typical honeybee or crops that are self-pollinating like tomatoes. So they're really important in these settings because they're able to provide very like fruitful fruit sets and help with the production of mass-produced crops. But while I just talked a lot about what the bees can do for us, I really want to focus this last bit on what we can be doing for the bees and how we need to be lending them a helping hand and not have such a human-centric view of only protecting species because they are good for humans, and trying to bring the focus back to taking care of the species that are so important for the environment and for just life in general. So there are several species that are at risk. The first is the rusty patch bumblebee, which is a federally endangered bumblebee that was listed under the Endangered Species Act in 2017. It was the first bumblebee or first insect ever to be placed on the endangered species list. And there's also the American bumblebee, which as of last year was denoted as needing further review. So it was evaluated to see if their populations have declined to the point where they need to also be listed as federally endangered. So it is under review right now, and we should have answers by 2025, I believe. There's also the yellow-banded bumblebee, which is listed as vulnerable due to pretty drastic population declines. So with all of these species, there's a lot of talk about how we can recover them and what we can be doing to help protect their populations and conserve them so that these species don't go extinct. And one option that I'm really excited about is that they could be captively reared. And this would be pending a lot of permitting to be able to work with these federally endangered species like the rusty patch bumblebee. But there are some pretty cool applications that we could use with the captive rearing techniques that we've developed. And because we have such high colony health and reduced mortality when it comes to captive reared species, because they're protected from variation in weather, exposure to pesticides and predation, they have reduced they're protected from reduced genetic variation and restricted access to floral and nesting resources. So this isn't to say that we should just be rearing all of our colonies in captivity. It's important that they're able to survive in the wild and continue doing what they're supposed to be doing. But when we have these species that are at risk, this is a really good option because it does help protect them from a lot of these external factors that are negatively impacting them in the wild. So as a conservation mitigation effort, we can then rear these colonies in captivity with the protocols that we've been putting in place over the last 15 years that I've helped to hone. Definitely was not around to help develop them from the beginning. But it's been really cool to see the process as we've learned more about these colonies from captively rearing different bumblebee species. So with these captive reared colonies, we can then go out back into the environment in areas where they have identified high suitability habitats, and we can reintroduce them back into the environment. And this is a practice called assisted reintroductions. And this is a practice that has been pretty widely used for a variety of different mammals. But being able to do it with our smaller invertebrate friends would be really impactful. And if we're able to do it successfully, where we can captively rear these species and then go and put them back into environments where they have the ability to survive and thrive, can not only help increase their population numbers, but can also increase the genetic variation available within those environments. So there are several habitats where the rusty patch bumblebee, for example, has been identified as having pretty high inbreeding due to their really small population size. So by bringing in colonies from other areas, we're able to then increase the genetic variation within that habitat. And I think that's really impactful if we want to see this species or several of these species be able to persist over a long period of time. So we're hoping that we'll be able to do some of this research where we're able to actually start reintroducing some colonies of not the endangered bumblebee, rusty patch bumblebee, but of some more lower risk, but still at-risk species within the next few years to see if this is a viable option. And with that, I want to thank the Strange Lab, who I've been working with over the last year, with my mentor, Dr. Jamie Strange, as well as postdocs, graduate students, and undergraduate students that have all helped with this research, as well as my collaborators at University of Alabama and University of Wyoming, who helped us catch these bees and get the National Science Foundation funding that helped support this research. And with that, I can take any questions, and please feel free to contact me with any questions, or if you just want fun bee facts, because I have lots of them. And yeah, thanks.
I gotta say, I'm loving the picture.
It's my favorite photo to use. It's so weird and fun.
You should definitely wear it at a conference.
Really should. I need to go back to Utah and get it. I was like I was the only one that fit in it for a while. So when we went to outreach events, I was always the person that got thrown into it. I was very happy about it.
So I had a question. So I know like we'll have two. Most of the research that you did was on the yellow-faced bumblebee. Was there a specific reason why you chose that particular species? And what did you guys do with the bumblebees after? Did you guys release them back into the wild?
So we did not release those. Well, I'll answer that sequentially in the order you asked. So with the grant that funded this research, it was looking at the epigenetic variation of different like thermoregulatory properties of bumblebees. And when I say that, I realize how little I know about that entire topic. It was a lot of genetic-based work that was looking at how different like elevational sites impact the ability for different traits to be passed down from like a gyne to her colony to the next generation of colonies. So we had 3 generations of these colonies that were produced. I just presented on the first one. But this species was selected because it is a very commonly found bumblebee within California, Oregon, and Washington, where we can find like a very high difference in elevational gradients. So that's why that species was specifically selected. And because they are able to be reared in the lab pretty well based off of previous research that my supervisor did with this species. And then as we produced the colonies in the lab and they got larger, we would ship them out to people in Wyoming to have them do different like thermoregulation studies to look at their thermal minimas, maximas to see how high of thresholds they can sustain. And then they would then ship it back to us and we would continue to take care of them. Once the colony reached the end of its life cycle, and this occurs once they stop producing any offspring, we then euthanize the colonies by putting them in a freezer, which is the practice that is the most sustainable way to euthanize a colony. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have questions for Morgan?
Yes. Hey, well,
Jay, hi.
So at one point you mentioned that some of the common habitats for your species are like urban parks and gardens. And I know that's kind of like an issue because like people put a lot of effort in terms of like conservations and creating habitats, but sometimes these are like unnatural habitats that pose other risks for the species. So what's the bumblebee situation? Are they being like benefited by people like actually like having very diverse gardens and providing plenty of pollination opportunities for them, or will they prefer like actual natural habitats here?
So the answer is it depends on the species. And I feel like that's like the lamest cop out for an answer that I could ever give, but it's also the most accurate from a biological standpoint, where there are certain species that have been found to like really thrive in these urban environments. But in general, like where there's areas that have more diverse floral resources that provide like good nutrients for the bumblebees, they will be found there. And in a lot of cases, that now is a lot of urban parks and gardens where people are creating these pollinator friendly habitats, or where they just want to have really pretty gardens that are like visually aesthetic, or have like visually aesthetic places. So while we would like to have more natural settings for these bumblebees, that's realistically not going to always be like what is actually able to occur. So providing these urban habitats is a really great option, and there are a lot of species that do very well in them.
Because the other thing that I was thinking is like you guys are being so careful in the lab doing the red light during incubation, but then those subpopulations who are living in this urban, they're just hit with like 24/7 light.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's anybody doing any like local adaptation studies or anything like similar.
So there are people doing studies in like vacant lots in Cleveland. Mary Gardner's lab has been doing really, really awesome work looking at the impacts of shrinking cities and how they support or don't support different pollinator communities. From a nesting situation, there's really not a lot that's been done for bumblebees, looking at local adaptations of like where they're even occurring or how well they're surviving in those environments. And I think that's largely due to the fact that finding bumblebee nests is very difficult. I've only found like a few out in the wild where I can see bumblebees like coming and going, but yeah, but it would be awesome to be able to look and figure out like where they're actually nesting, and if they are nesting in those places, how big do their colonies get and how well do they survive, and just like different risks that are in place.
I have a question.
Sweet.
When, like with these species that are endangered or threatened, like, do they know why they decreased in the first place? I'm just thinking like adding, what if you add more, hatched bumblebees and then they just can't survive or something like that,
Yes. So there are a lot of different factors that go into bumblebee declines. They've broadly been attributed to pathogens and pests that are introduced from other species such as honeybees, pesticides, land use change. So as we have like more urbanized environments or agriculturally intensified or expanded environments, and a big one now is climate change, with changes in like the extreme weather events or different intensities of precipitation and climate or temperature patterns. So there are a whole slew of issues that are causing these population declines. And that is something that we're taking into consideration when reintroducing colonies, if we are able to do this, is making sure that we're identifying sites that have habitats that could most likely support these new colonies being placed there. And this coming year, I'm going to be doing a lot of research on identifying or putting these threats on a map and doing like habitat suitability modeling so that we're able to identify like these specific locations based on projected climate trends and areas where there's more like diverse floral resources and reduced pesticide use, to help make sure that we aren't just placing them out in a field and then coming back like a week later and having them all dead, because that's like the last thing you want to do is put all of this work and effort into trying to protect them and then to have them just die right then and there would be horrible. So yeah, there's a lot of work being done to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I guess if it's like, if for some reason there was an extreme weather event and they died in that area and there's no connectivity, then it would be like that would make sense. I was also wondering if you have any insight into, there's like a species here in Southern California that's like on the verge of, I think it's a candidate for listing, the crotchii.
Oh yeah.
Bumblebee. I was wondering if you knew anything about that.
So it is on the list of like imperiled bumblebees. So there's the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign that has a bumblebee task force that basically identifies bumblebees that are considered like at risk. It's kind of similar to the like International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN. I think I said that right. PJ, please correct me if I'm wrong. And with that, I don't know exactly what factors specifically led to that species decline, but I would guess it's the same that are impacting all of the other ones. And I do think that it is also up for listing within the next, like, I think it's being reviewed or has been reviewed. But yeah, it's definitely in decline, and work is being done to like help identify things that can be done to hopefully conserve or protect the species.
Well, that's good. Cool.
I hope that answered your question. I feel like I rambled a lot right there.
No, that yeah, sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for your questions.
I have a question now that Thea kind of brought it up. If for releasing the bumblebees, like let's say the ones that you guys had in captivity,
Mhm.
like you release them and then you go back and you want to check on them to see if they're still there, right? But would you guys like for some, like, I don't know, can you do it with bumblebees, like tag them or something to see it's like, okay, this is one that we released or it wasn't? Is there a way to do that?
Yes. So there's actually a few ways. So for a different study that I did, I took lab reared colonies and I placed them out into vegetable fields. And we like created these little bee structures. Since they are eusocial, they have like a very they're central place foragers, so they'll always come back to their colony. So we're able to create these environments that help keep them shaded and protected from like other pests that like coming into the colonies like ants. And then with those, we can also like pull a leg off of a bumblebee to use that to identify like their colony's genotypes. And with that, any bumblebee that was then collected after, so if we were like out in the field just collecting a bee, we could then take like a little tarsal clipping, so like clip its foot off, which doesn't harm them from a like biological standpoint. And then use that to identify whether it was a bee from our released colony or if it was just like a native bee out foraging in the environment. There's also these like little they're like almost like pit tags, but smaller, that you can put on bees to like track them. But a lot of people haven't been using them because they fall off really easily and they're really expensive. You can also do like video cameras with like Raspberry Pis in the colonies to like track them. So there's a lot of like really cool technology being developed right now to help like figure out what bees are from colonies and which ones aren't.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah.
That actually sounds pretty cool, like what you guys are doing to do that.
The conference that I was telling you about earlier, there was like an entire section on like AI and technology for pollinators, and I was geeking out the whole time. It was really cool.
Time to implement them. Okay, is there any other questions for Mo? Okay, if not, thank you again, Mo, for coming and talking to us via Zoom. I definitely learned a little bit more about bumblebees. It was pretty interesting, pleased to say. And I hope you guys enjoyed Mo's talk. We will have our next expert series talk next month on July 22nd, I believe, with Dr. Chris Lowe, who will be talking about sharks. So hopefully you guys can attend it. So with that, thank you again, Mo, and I hope you enjoy your weekend.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me. This was so fun.
Oh, you're welcome. I might have to invite you again when you have more updates.
Yes.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thea.